Hello everyone, my name is Natalie and welcome back to my channel. I'm in the middle of reorganizing my bookshelf, and while I have all of my books off my shelves, I thought I would go ahead and share my physical TBR. All the books that I own, they have survived multiple unhauls over the years, and yet I still haven't read them for some reason. I have them all stacked up beside me, and we're not gonna go in any particular order, just whatever I grab. First up, I have a collection of Emily Bronte's poetry from the Everyman Library's Pocket Poets collection. I am a big fan of the Bronte sisters and their writing. I'm trying to go through all of their novels, and you may know that they did write novels, but you might not know that they all also wrote poetry. And it's one of my goals, not just this year, but in general, to read more poetry collections, because I do love poetry, and I feel like I read, both in and outside of school, poems just on their own individually, but I don't read collections like this very often, and yet I have like almost an entire shelf of books like this. I guess with this, I'm kind of killing two birds with one stone, knocking out two goals, whittling away at my physical TBR while also reading more poetry. Next up, we have another Everyman Library Pocket Poet collection, and this is William Wordsworth. I don't think I've ever read William Wordsworth poems, but both of these little collections I got as, I think, Christmas gifts. And actually, when I was in England last year, I got to go to his house and garden, and it was really cool. And I'm hoping that like those pictures and memories are going to motivate me to read his poetry. Next up, we have another poetry book, and it is Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. This is a leather-bound word cloud classics edition. It is absolutely gorgeous. All of their covers are gorgeous. This was another gift, but I do really enjoy Walt Whitman's poetry. I have read some of this, I just haven't read all of it, and I'd like to get through the entire book. Next up, we have Some Kind of Happiness by Claire Lagrange. This is a more recent acquirement. I saw someone I follow on Instagram talking about it. I don't know much about it. I just know it's about a young girl who is sent to live with her grandparents for the summer. She finds that the forest behind their house contains the enchanted realm that she kind of like imagined and played pretend with when she was younger, and my cat just joined us, of course. This kingdom is also in trouble and she has to save it. I believe it's also about depression and mental health, if I'm remembering correctly from like this one post I saw. For that reason, it is on my TBR for the May Mental Health-a-thon. I have not been doing a ton of reading in May, so I guess you'll just have to wait for my May wrap-up to see if I actually get to this book, but I do want to read it soon. Next, we have The Alice Network by Kate Quinn. My sister's currently reading this, hence the bookmark, but this is a book I got for Christmas, and it's one I'm really excited to read. I've heard a lot about this book over the past couple of years, and it's totally up my alley. It takes place after World War II, and it follows a young pregnant woman who goes to Europe to try and find her cousin who went missing in Nazi-occupied France during the war. They haven't heard from her since. They haven't been able to find her. And during that time, she runs into a woman who may have connections to her cousin and know where she is. And this woman was part of a female spy ring called the Alice Network that worked during, I believe, both of the world wars. Historical fiction, and I don't know, I've just been really into the idea of spies and espionage recently. So this is another one that I would like to get to soon. Next, we have East by Edith Patow. I don't know how to say it, but this is a book that I've read about halfway a couple of times, and I've never been able to get all the way through it, but I just don't know why I never get all the way through it, and I want to read the whole thing, because it is a fairy tale retelling of East of the Sun, West of the Moon. which is a lot like Beauty and the Beast. You have this girl who is basically taken away by this polar bear, and she has to live in his palace. But really, he is a prince who has been cursed, and she has to help break the curse. I really love the fairy tale, and I want to love this book, so I think I'm going to give it one more try before getting rid of it. Next, we have Beauty and Thorns by Kate Forsyth. This is one of my most anticipated reads of 2020. This is high priority on my list. Now I am done with my junior year of college, and I have the summer to read. This book immediately appealed to me because it is about the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which is my favorite art movement, like, ever. A lot of their art was inspired by mythology and fairy tales and the medieval times, like the romantic stories and poetry and everything. And this book specifically follows the artist muses, so the women in their lives, and it also revolves around the creation of a particular series of paintings. I did the Sleeping Beauty cycle. The really cool thing is I actually got to see those paintings when I was in England. I know Kate Forsyth does a lot of historical, female-centric fairy tale retellings, and because this one does deal with the painting on the Sleeping Beauty tale, I'm thinking that this will also kind of have a Sleeping Beauty retelling element of some kind to it. I'm not sure. This is another historical fiction novel. It follows a Chinese American girl named Jo who works as a lady's maid to a wealthy woman, but during the night she operates as an anonymous newspaper columnist for the advice column Dear Miss Sweetie. She's trying to keep her identity a secret because, although I'm not sure about the time period, I'm thinking late 1800s, early 1900s, judging by the clothes, I do know it takes place in the American South. So to have a Chinese American woman writing an advice column would be quite controversial. So she's trying to keep her identity under wrap, but she gets into a lot of trouble when she uses her column to address things like sexism and racism. So she has to deal with that, and she's also trying to find out what happened to her parents as she is an orphan. I think I've only read a few books about Chinese Americans in a historical setting, so I'm definitely interested in seeing that perspective in American history. Next, we have The Tolkien Reader by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is another book that I've read part way, but not entirely. I had to read this for class this semester. A collection of some of Tolkien's short stories. I have read 3 or 4 of them, and I think I only have 2 left. I'm keeping it in case I do want to read the other stories. I just don't know if I will. I'm just not a big short story person. For whatever reason, I have a harder time focusing on them and enjoying them compared to full-length novels. It's the same thing with graphic novels, comic books, things like that. I did like most of the stories I read for class, so I'm hoping that motivates me to read the last couple stories in this book, because it's really not that much reading left to do. Next, we have The Legends of King Arthur. I'm not going to try and say the French. I just know it translates to The Death of King Arthur because it ends with that, by Sir Thomas Malory. I love legends, mythology, fairy tales, things like that, and I especially love the tales of King Arthur. Next, we have The Showing Forth of Christ by John Donne. John Donne was an English poet and priest. This is a collection of some of his sermons. I'm a big fan of his poetry, so when I saw this in a used book sale, I thought it would be really cool to read some of his sermons as well. Next, we have The Complete Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe. This is another book I've read partway through, and it's one that I definitely want to finish this year. A couple years ago, I was reading through it in October, so I knew I wouldn't have a ton of time to read, and short stories and poems, that should be pretty easy to read through. I got all the way through the short story collection, and then November and December happened. They were really hectic, so I never got to the poetry part. Again, I want to read more poetry, and Edgar Allan Poe is one of my favorite writers. The next book I have not read is, this is a long title, Bienville's Dilemma, A Historical Geography of New Orleans by Richard Campanella. This is a book I've read partway through, and I'm not going to finish it, but I'm not going to get rid of it either, because this was part of an award I won in high school for being an outstanding English student, and there's a community service element in there as well. But this was part of the award. I did try to read it. It goes into how New Orleans was founded, why it was chosen, because it just wasn't a good area to try and found a new colony. And I got to a chapter about the soil. It was just about the soil, and it was really boring, and I just stopped reading it. I've tried to read it a couple times since then, and it's still just not keeping my attention, but I worked hard for this. Next, we have the Poet's Book of Psalms. This is kind of a rendition of all the different psalms in the Bible, rendered by different poets in from the 16th to 20th century. Recently, as I've been establishing a routine with my Bible reading, I have been liking reading some from my Bible, but also from some kind of Christian book as well. Currently, I'm going through a Christian poetry book. I have a couple other books I want to be reading through too, like just a section or a chapter or so in the morning. And this is another book I would like to add to that roster of books I want to read in the morning along with my Bible reading. Psalms themselves are poems and songs, so I thought it would be really cool to see how more modern poets saw them as well. Next, we have In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. This is a true crime novel about the murder of a family in Kansas, the police investigation, the trial. I don't read a lot of mystery or crime or thriller novel, which is interesting because I love to watch crime shows and police shows, things like that. I love CSI and NCIS, Law and Order. I do want to read more classics, and I feel like this one it's really intriguing to me because of the true crime element, but it's, in terms of classics, it's more modern, and it's also not really in a genre I read much. It's a little out of my comfort zone, so I thought this would be an interesting classic to read. Next up, we have Main Street by Sinclair Lewis. This was a birthday gift from a dear friend of mine, and that was several years ago, and I'm a little embarrassed that I have not read this yet. It's kind of thick, and it's intimidating. It's also a satire about small-town America. It's not something I would normally read, but it's one of her favorite books. It follows this woman from a big city who ends up marrying this country doctor, moves back home with him, and there's just a lot of tension and conflict between her and the townspeople. There's just a lot of social criticism, classism, commentary on the urban and rural divide and differences. I don't know. It's one of those books I feel like I should read, but I don't know if I will. It might be many years, but it was a gift from a friend, and I feel compelled to read it, and that I should read it. So that's why it's staying on my shelf. Next is another true crime novel. It is The Complete Jack the Ripper by Donald Rumbelow. Again, I'm really interested in true crime. I am a big history buff, so the whole historical murder crime thing is really interesting. But also, Donald Rumbelow was my history professor when I was studying in England. He's apparently an expert on the Jack the Ripper murders. He has been in several documentaries. He leads a lot of Jack the Ripper tours. And he wrote this book, and I got it while I was there. Next, we have The Kite Runner by Colette Husseini. This is one of those more modern classic books that everyone should read. And I do want to read it. I'm interested in the storyline. Plus, I have realized how little my history classes in school have talked about more recent history. I don't think we've ever gotten past World War II in any of the classes I've been in. I've also realized how little I know about the wars in the Middle East and the things that led up to them. And we're talking about conflicts that are still going on today. They heavily influence politics and political decisions and voting, and I know it's a really important book for me to read. Again, I do actually want to read it. I just have kept putting it off because I also know it is very heavy, it is very emotional, and I just haven't prepared myself for it. I might just have to bite the bullet and go in blind and just read it and be devastated. Have a book hangover and recover after a while and read something much happier, because it might never get read otherwise. Next we have Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. I am a huge fan of Jane Austen, and this is the next Jane Austen book I want to read as I go through all of her books. It's been described as a gothic parody, and it's about this young woman who is absolutely obsessed with the gothic genre and lots of cliches and tropes. She ends up falling in love and is invited to stay at his family mansion, Northanger Abbey, and it just has all of those gothic elements. It's this old kind of creepy house, and she's just immediately filled with suspicion. She's thinking of all these gothic books she's read, and she kind of starts investigating and sticking her nose into stuff, and it just sounds really fun. Next we have William Shakespeare's The Sonnets and A Lover's Complaint. Like most English majors, I am a huge Shakespeare fan. I really don't like reading plays that much. I prefer to see them on stage, but I do typically enjoy reading Shakespeare's plays, and I want to read more of his poetry. And I want to read more of his poetry as well. Next up we have City of Ghosts by Victoria Schwab, or V.E. Schwab. I've never read any of her books, but I thought a middle grade would be a great place to start. The main appeal of this book to me is that it is set in Scotland, specifically Edinburgh. I love Scotland, it has my heart, I want to go back so bad. This follows a girl named Cass who has the ability to see ghosts, and she ends up going to Edinburgh when her parents land a gig hosting a TV show about the world's most haunted places. She meets another girl who has the same abilities, and I'm not quite sure about the rest of the plot. It's very vague. It just says there's a lot more to the supernatural realm that she has to learn about, and they have to act fast because the City of Ghosts is becoming more and more dangerous. So I'm excited to see where this book goes, and also just all the travel and adventure and all the Scotland and just everything about Scotland. Next we have Melmoth by Sara Perry. This is another book that kind of has supernatural elements. It is a historical fiction novel taking place, I believe, in Prague, and it follows this woman whose friend goes missing, and she keeps finding these mysterious letters and accounts about this figure called Melmoth the Wanderer, who's basically cursed to wander the earth for eternity. The main character believes that Melmoth is connected to all these disappearances and strange occurrences. Apparently this is kind of a retelling of I believe a medieval play or folktale or something of that nature, which is more obscure, but that's really interesting to me. Next we have Heart So Fierce and Broken by Bridget Kimmerer. This is the second book in the Cursebreakers trilogy, the sequel to A Curse So Dark and Lonely, which was one of my favorite books that I've read in 2019. I won this copy in a pre-order giveaway from Kat here on BookTube and Bookstagram at Rustic Pages. This was one of my most anticipated releases of 2020. I have not read it because school has just been keeping me too busy, and I'm excited enough about this book. I want to be able to devote as much time to it as possible. I don't want to have to keep putting it down because of school, and now I have the time to do that. Next we have Notes from the Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky, who was a Russian author. I have read a couple of his books. I've read Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov, and I really love The Brothers Karamazov, and I would like to read some of his short stories. as well, just to explore more of his works without them being giant epic Russian novels. Next we have All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Marie Remarque. This book is about German soldiers during World War I, about their experiences during the war. I believe it is also about their experience trying to reintegrate into normal German society after the war, which is greatly affected by their PTSD from the war. As you can see from the cover, it's supposedly the greatest war novel of all time. I love war novels. I love war history, and especially learning more about the world wars. And I think this will be a really unique perspective because not only is it focusing on the German side of the conflict and how just everyone was affected in the war, but the author himself fought in World War I. So this is also a deeply personal book. It actually gained a lot of controversy for being pacifist and anti-war. During the Nazi regime, it was also considered anti-German and was one of the books that they burnt. This is, I think, the oldest unread book I have on my shelf, and it's been that way because I know, like The Kite Runner, it's going to be a very emotional, devastating read, and I just haven't prepared myself for it. Next we have The Plays of Oscar Wilde. This is another book I have partly read. I had to read The Importance of Being Earnest for a high school English class, and I ended up keeping this collection of plays because, as I've said before, I don't read plays very often. I prefer to see them performed and acted out, but I do really like Oscar Wilde's writing style and his wit, so I do feel like I would still enjoy reading the rest of his plays. Okay, we are down to like the last 4 books, I think. Next we have the complete poems of Jan Donne. Again, I love his poetry. I've read some of it. I have not read all of it. All these last books are poetry, I'm realizing. We have the collected poems of Emily Dickinson. I really enjoy Emily Dickinson's poetry and I want to read more of it. I have read partway through this collection, I just haven't read the rest of it. I need to read the rest of it. Maybe when it comes to these poetry books, I should just start with the ones that I need to finish before getting into anything new. Next we have Ballistics by Billy Collins. I've read some of his poems in a creative writing class in high school and really enjoyed it, and I was really happy to find one of his collections at our local Second and Charles store. Our store does not have a great poetry selection, and most of it is more classic poets like Robert Frost and Emily Dickinson, so I was surprised that I could find something like this. It has been a while since I have read those poems that initially introduced me into his work, but I'm hoping I still enjoy it. And the very last book is the complete poems of Maya Angelou. This book was a gift from my aunt, who shares my love for poetry, and Maya Angelou is one of her favorite poets. Again, I've read some of these poems. I've probably read the least of this collection compared to the other ones that I've partly read, but I do really like her writing style and just how present and noticeable her voice is in her poems, so I do want to read more of them. I completely forgot that I was going to put these books on the shelves behind me as I was finishing talking about them, so let me do that real quick and also count how many unread books I own. As you can see, my unread books are currently taking up about 1.5 shelves. It's quite a bit of space and I have 31 unread books total, which isn't as much as I thought. And then I remembered that I did do an unhaul recently. Some of those books went in the unhaul pile, and I did have a bunch of books on my unread list that were technically for classes, so I have read through those this semester. I completely forgot about my unread ebooks. I don't think I have very many unread ebooks, so I think I'm just going to list them in the description box and link them if you're interested. Okay, that is all for today's video. Those are all of the books that I own and need to read. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and click the notification bell, because now that it is summer, I will have more time to film and edit, and I have some really exciting videos coming your way. Have a wonderful rest of your day, keep reading, and I will see you next time here on The Mighty Quill.